Welcome back. This is the second version of the continuing lecture, and I will share my screen and just talk more about the continuing threads that we discussed in the first part of this. So I want to begin this time with one of the largest buildings designed in traditional Japan, the Todaiji Temple. Many of you may know that this temple was more than twice the size of the present one. It burned down twice during its history, and it was a monk by the name of Chogen who was actually largely responsible for building it to, almost its original size, slightly smaller in terms of the length and the width, because the timber that was needed for this building was so difficult to obtain. And some of us have written about this in our books and our papers, where Chogen goes on a very interesting expedition, a political expedition to find the wood, etc. And his dedication to building this is incredibly fantastic. There's a book that may interest some of you called Brunelleschi's Dome. It is written by an author by the name of Ross King. Those of you that are interested in how big architecture was created in different parts of the world, I think this is a book that many of you must read. And it's very similar to the kind of efforts that are going on here. In fact, some of us have written that it is not unfair to compare Chogen to Brunelleschi, because Brunelleschi, as many of you know, was in the 14th century in Italy, in Florence. The Duomo, which stands today, was complete as a cathedral, but nobody knew how to build the gigantic dome. And it was Brunelleschi who finally took on the challenge, went to Rome, studied the Pantheon with the famous oculus, came back and invented a structural system that would finally create the magnificent Duomo. So in many ways, Chogen's dedication to rebuilding the Todaiji Temple remains a very important moment that ties traditional architecture and its rebuilding in the medieval era of Japan. The Shaso-in, again, structural integrity. We've talked about this. I just wanted to recap what this means. And we come now to one of the most emblematic buildings ever designed in the history of modern Japan. This is now the 1960s Olympics. The year is 1960. Japan is hosting the Olympics. Japan has already become an economic superpower. And one emerging name, very famous name in modern architecture, is the name of Kenzo Tange. And Kenzo Tange designs a stadium called the Yoyogi Stadium, where he, for the first time in the history of modern architecture anywhere in the world, and particularly outside the West, he actually takes modern materials like steel and concrete and creates an architectural form that reminds you of that particular culture. In this case, the answer is very clear. You can see the curve of the roof. You can see the curve of the roof here. For some people, it looks like a samurai's hat. For other people, it reminds them of the curved roofs of Japan. Basically, this is a tension cable that holds the span of this gigantic roof, which is then rooted into these two columns. And the tension cable is expressed as a moment right here before it is embedded into the ground. In fact, if you look at it from the other side, it's painted red. It's a very beautiful moment. So this is a beautiful building that is designed in steel and concrete, very elegant. But for the first time, in both its profile, its concept, it is not necessarily abstract in the total sense. It reminds you of something Japanese in terms of the hats, the symbols, the curves. So the famous architectural historian Siegfried Giedion is writing this famous book called Space-Time in Architecture in the 1950s. It has become a classic already, and he's now publishing his 5th edition of the book. We had originally written it in the 50s, but now it is like 1961, and he's writing the 5th edition. And having seen this building, having heard of this building, he includes it in Space-Time and Architecture as the only example from the non-Western world announcing that the non-Western world, particularly in Japan, have now created something that is original to Japan in the form of modernism. And this begins to incept an era in Japanese architecture that makes it noticed to the entire world, when modern architecture in Japan now becomes a very important aspect of world architecture. One of the most important movements that happens in the 1960s is that under Kenzo Tange's leadership, a bunch of people who work in his office, younger architects, who are emerging talents, come together and form a movement called metabolism. Now, this is a very interesting movement because it also ties back to Japanese threads, traditional Japanese roots. I've already told you about the concept of impermanence, the idea of constant change. For example, Buddhist philosophy, when Buddhism arrives in Japan, one of the important concepts in Buddhist theory and Buddhist philosophy is the concept of mujo, which is impermanence, constant change. In fact, the Buddha said the only constant thing there is in the universe is change. So the idea that the traditional Japanese celebrate seasons, in the summer you will wear a different kimono. In the living room of a traditional Japanese house, in the kakemono in the tokonoma, the scroll is changed depending on the season. So seasons, time, the consciousness of passing time is constantly there in Japanese culture. And what these young modern architects do is they now, for the first time in Japanese architectural history, in the modern era, they begin to rethink of it in architectural form. So they say, instead of creating an architecture that looks frozen and permanent, what about creating an architecture that looks as if it's constantly going to change? And this gives rise to various concepts together known as metabolism, the word coming from the constant changes that are happening in your body. They call it metabolism. And basically, different architects, Fumihiko Maki, Kiyanori Kikutake, Kisho Kurokawa, Kenzo Tange, many of these, they in their own way, they promote different ways of thinking about architecture, but the fundamental idea is still the same, that you have infrastructure like the column of the Horyuji Pagoda, and things that are attached to these infrastructural elements that can then be removed and changed again in time. Many of these grand visions, they create all kinds of grand visions in the form of futuristic cities, etc. None of these visions happen because they are way too grand. However, one building that Kisho Kurokawa designs in 1972, which is a very important monument in Japanese modernism, is the Nakajin Capsule Tower. And it is the one you see in this slide. You can see that this tower has this is in downtown Tokyo. You can see that it has two infrastructural vertical cores. It has a base and then prefabricated modules of 3 meters by 3 meters by 3 meters with a circular window, which is a room where you have a bathroom and where you have a little sleeping space. It's like a micro unit, is hauled by a crane and attached to these infrastructural cores. The original concept that Kisho Kurokawa has is very clear. He sees this as a temporary building where these will be removed over time and new configurations of these blocks will happen. Of course, it never changes eventually, but that is the original concept. But the building is so famous that it remains like this. And very strangely, I don't know if you know this phenomenon in Japan. There was a very nice paper in the 1990s when the economy of Japan was at its peak. What they call the economic bubble. There was a paper by the scholar Botan Bognar, and he called it, what goes up must come down. And basically what he was saying is, because land is so scarce in Japan today, Tokyo particularly, but all over Japan, the only way to keep the real estate economy alive in many cities in Japan is to take buildings, construct them, what goes up, and then demolish them, come down, and build new buildings again. So he was saying that the average lifespan of a building in Japan, the average lifespan is less than 20 years. So every year in Japan, he was remarking in the 1990s that every year in Tokyo, almost 30% of Tokyo is changed. 30% from facade improvements to entire buildings are taken down and they're rebuilt. So the reason I'm telling you this is because in the midst of this pattern, the Nakajin Capsule Tower became a huge controversy. It was over time, the concrete has deteriorated and the living conditions there are not very good anymore. And so this building by the developer was slated for demolition. But guess what happened? This building had become such an important modern icon worldwide that Western architects threw an uproar and basically wrote a petition that said that this building should not be demolished. And it is still under a lot of controversy to figure out what the future of this building is. So again, one of the very few small-scale, medium-scale manifestations of the metabolism movement that has now become an icon worldwide. You can see the units, the modules here. These are the micro units that each one is actually brought in and connected to the central core, and they are little tiny rooms in the wake of land scarcity in Tokyo. These are the rooms that Kurokawa expected to be one of the prototypes of living. But architects also have visually used traditional elements and amalgamated them to modern architecture, quite literally. For example, one of the most identifiable elements of traditional Japan is the shoji screen. As you know, the beauty of a shoji screen is like the beauty of a Japanese chopstick. If you go to a Chinese restaurant, Chinese or Korean chopsticks are very heavy. They're made of metal. They're made of heavy wood. But they're pretty heavy if you hold them. But if you think of Japanese chopstick, it's very light. It's made of very light wood. So it wouldn't be unfair to think of the shoji screen as analogous to the Japanese chopstick, because the shoji screen, the one characteristic of a shoji screen is very, very light. You can take your little finger and move it and it will move. It's that light. It's a very light opening. And one of the reasons it's light is because it is nothing more than a membrane of it's a cage of very thin wood members. And then there is what is called a washi paper, which is rice husk paper, washi, very, very light. And what is beautiful about it is you can slide it, you can look into the garden as you see here, but the washi paper also diffuses the light that comes into the room. So the shoji has become a very identifiable element of Japan. And the modern architects like Fumihiko Maki, particularly, have used the aesthetic of the shoji screen in some of their modern buildings. So you can see, for example, how the gridded lines of the shoji screen, even to the point of sort of attaching a shoji-like element on his building, is like a symbol of Japanese architecture. So while the building is essentially very abstract, immediately reminds you of some of the patterns and some of the ideas that came from traditional Japan via the invention of the shoji screen. One of the most prototypical aspects of Japanese rooms comes from the Zen monastery. This is what we call a shoin. A shoin is a room in a Zen monastery. It's largely empty. It's used for various activities, but the furniture is brought into the room and space is created for particular activities. This kind of minimalism begins to fascinate modern architects, because in a time when neoclassical architecture in the 1890s was very prevalent in Europe, and when the first new materials came into the market, concrete, steel, the elevator, the car, industrial revolution at its peak. Now architects are no longer interested in thinking of ornament or pediments or Greek classical orders. They are interested in rejecting this, interested in creating a rupture. This is also a time when art begins to see many tremendous leaps. Picasso talks about cubism, which is the idea that instead of the the way of looking at reality only from the point of view of perspective, where, for a long time, European Renaissance, if you look at Renaissance paintings, they were always about perspective, vanishing point. So depth is achieved through meeting visually at a point. But Picasso challenges that, and he says, well, why should we look at reality from one vantage point? Why not superimpose various ways of looking at it? So when you think of a painting like the Guernica or others, they're superimposed abstractions of various points that give reality a completely different idea. There is futurism, where artists begin to, through inventions like the camera, for example, talk about showing movement through, a golfer hitting the golf stick, but through a series of frames, one after the other, after the other, after the other. So there are many ways of thinking about this. The long story short is, all of these things begin to challenge the idea of ornamental buildings. And we now, modern architects in the 30s and 40s and 20s are interested in stripping away ornament and actually talking about kind of austerity, particularly in Europe and the United States. And when many of them encounter the Japanese showings, they're fascinated because they now begin to see a validation of those kind of ideas where there is a rejection of ornament and absolute minimalism, and they begin to find a kinship to it. So Japanese architects who grow under the influence of modern architects take this aesthetic and make something amazing out of it. This is the work of Tadawando, the same person who designed the Buddhist temple that I showed you in the first lecture. And one of the things he does in the 1960s, in his early days, is he realizes that Tokyo has become so cacophonic as a city that it doesn't make any sense to open a house towards the city. There is nothing to look at. It's it's a city that you want to stay away from because it's very fierce. It's very, very rough out there. So he designs a house that has a blank wall on the outside, and most of it is like a courtyard on the inside in concrete, just in bare concrete. And the house becomes very famous, and he begins to develop now an aesthetic that is about exposed concrete. And he begins to master this art in all his buildings. But there is a very important aesthetic connection here with traditional Japan, at least for me, which is the concept of wabi-sabi. If we look at, wabi-sabi means rustic humility. Rusticity, humility, frugality, simplicity. So this is a concept that becomes very important during the tea ceremony, the peak of the tea ceremony times in the Momoyama era under Sen no Rikyu, etc. When Sen no Rikyu, for example, the great Zen master, designs a tea hut, he emulates the hut of a hermit deep in the forest. How would a hermit design a hut deep in the forest? It would be very simple, very rustic, very minimal. The wood would be exposed because he doesn't have paint. The room would have nothing in it except maybe one scroll because you have to meditate on it. So there is the stripping of all that is not necessary. And I find in the work like this, a similar kind of austerity, which is a remnant of the wabi-sabi concepts of Japan that are now being interpreted in a modern idiom. I think one of the most important exchanges between Japan and the West happens through Western architects who have designed in Japan, but now return back to the West. Of course, the most important name here is Frank Lloyd Wright. I don't know if you know, but Frank Lloyd Wright collected woodblock prints. And there was an apprentice of Frank Lloyd Wright who worked with him on many of his buildings in the US by the name of Rudolf Schindler. Now, when the Imperial Hotel was happening in the 1930s, Rudolf Schindler was supposed to go to Japan to supervise that project, but he doesn't. And eventually he leaves the Frank Lloyd Wright's office, comes to settle down in Los Angeles and designs a house in Los Angeles, which is one of my favorite houses in Los Angeles right now, which is called the Kings Road House. There's this house, and I will talk about this a little bit in a few minutes. And at the same time, in the 1930s and 40s, the famous Green and Green brothers, who were also very much interested in Japanese architecture and read a lot about it and were vocal about it. They loved Japanese architecture. Designed a very beautiful, a large bungalow, a large built from scratch house for Mr. Gamble of Procter and Gamble. And they call it the Gamble House. And you can see very clearly the influence of Japanese architecture. It's an American house, a modern house, but you know, the large cantilevers, the wood, the members. So while the look of the house is American, is a large form of the American bungalow, it's a tribute to a lot of the concepts they admire about Japan. But I want to talk more about the Kings Road House. Because the first time I went to the Kings Road House, when I came to the US in 96, and I think I must have visited it somewhere around 98, and I was absolutely impressed would be the right word, that here was the first house that I had seen that actually was not Japanese in form, but Japanese in space. A first Western house that was not literally, but just in its own way, very Japanese in space. So I wrote about it, and the paper reached the hands of a very famous scholar of Rudolf Schindler by the name of Catherine Smith, who had written the first book of Schindler. And then she was gracious enough to invite me for lunch because she said, nobody has written about this house this way. And we had a wonderful exchange about it, which reminds you that there are so many ways of interpreting architecture. So what is it that I thought was Japanese about Schindler's house? And this is why I compared these with traditional photographs. So example, the photograph to the top left is a reminder of what we call the engawa, which is the concept of the traditional veranda under the projecting roof that connects you to the garden. And if you look at the Schindler house, it does exactly the same thing. The roof is projected out. In the case of the engawa, of course, the building is raised. In the case of the Schindler house, it is not. The floor inside and the floor outside is the same. But you can see the similarity quite clearly. The interface between outside and in is very clearly expressed. The second one is the canvas doors that Rudolf Schindler uses. They reminded me of the Fusuma screens. I mean, look at the drawing to the bottom. These are simple doors that separate the rooms. And Schindler, who had never been to Japan, but obviously had probably been influenced by Japanese architecture, by his books and his conversations probably with Frank Lloyd Wright, now creates a house that is so distinctly Japanese in so many ways. I mean, the sort of rusticity of it is very, very Japanese. The third one is the idea of frontality. If you look at the, this is also something I shared with you guys in the previous lecture. If you look at the screen at the bottom, this is from one of the tea houses. You can see that Japanese compositions of walls are much more pleasing when you look at them frontally. And when you move through the Schindler house, the compositions are largely frontal. They are not diagonal. You move and you see a wall in front of you, and then you turn at a right angle and turn at a right angle, as if you're actually going through Katsura Villa or something like that. It's very interesting that Rudolf Schindler never visited Japan, but he knew about all these concepts. The fourth one is, of course, the rusticity. This is the Teian tea room, done by Senno Rikyu, very famous tea house. You can see that the surface of the wall has a soot on it, but it is not hidden, it is exposed. So every element, every rustic material is not concealed, it is exposed, as if to show the rusticity of architecture. And this is the Schindler house, where he takes precast concrete. This is the fireplace in the house. And he just leaves it like a raw surface, just like you would do in one of the tea houses. So I remember the first time I went, I found this incredibly fascinating, that Schindler would actually think of these elements. Whether he did it purposely or what, I do not know, but I see a similarity in it in so many ways. I now want to sort of bring you to modern Tokyo to talk about a side of modernism in Japan, which we don't find too much in the rest of the world. This is Omotesando, one of the most important streets in Japan. And on Omotesando, there are very tiny pieces of land. You know, the lot, because land is so expensive, the parcels available for development and architecture are very, very small. And they have resulted in some very unique buildings. So here is a beautiful street called Omotesando. You can see it is surrounded by very dense fabric. And here are two buildings. The one that you see with the zigzag pieces is done by famous architect Toyo Ito, and the old house that existed there to the left was demolished to create a second building that you see. That, and you can see this in the diagrams below. The Todd building, as this is called, hugs the building around it, and then in front of it is another architect who designs a circular building. But what is peculiar about these buildings is their thinness. You can see how thin, as if they're hugging each other. And this is not a kind of architecture you find too much in Europe or the United States. This is very Japanese, very modern. So the point I'm trying to make here is, we find now that because of land pressure, Japanese modernism is creating signatures of architectural identity that is not about aesthetics, but about land pressure and constraints. And thin buildings that are unique and innovative are emerging in ways that we do not find in other parts of the world. In other words, modernism, through concrete, glass, steel, is now taking a whole other guise because of the kind of land pressures that Japan is seeing that we do not find elsewhere in other parts of the world. So we come now to a point where Japanese architecture has identities today that other places do not share. One of the great tasks for us as cultural enthusiasts, not necessarily as architects, is to continue to trace the threads that tie the past with that of the future. The greatest test of any culture eventually does not lie in what it has obliterated, but what has remained in the process of all the evolutions that have taken place over the ages. Thank you so much, and I hope to answer some of your questions. I hope I have answered some of your questions or thoughts that you had through these two talks. Thank you.